I remember the sound of the gavel hitting the wooden block. It was sharp, final, and louder than I expected. That sound marked the moment everything I had built, everything I loved, was taken from me. The judge's voice blurred into the background as I stared at my ex-husband across the courtroom. Daniel sat there with that same calm confidence he always had, the kind that made people believe he was honest, gentle, reasonable. But I knew better. I knew the man behind that charming mask, and as he held our lawyer's gaze, pretending to be wounded and noble, I realized I had underestimated how far he would go to destroy me. When the verdict was read, I didn't cry, not in front of them. The court awarded him the custody of our 2 children, and the house, our home, worth over $3.5 million, along with most of our shared assets. I was left with a few personal belongings and the old, forgotten property my late mother left behind in the countryside. I remember standing there, frozen, my mind trying to catch up with the reality of what just happened. My lawyer, Karen, whispered that we'd appeal, but I could hear in her tone that she knew it was hopeless. Daniel had prepared too well. His team of attorneys had painted me as unstable, distracted, even negligent, twisting small, ordinary mistakes into something monstrous, and people believed him. After the trial ended, he didn't even look at me. He just collected the papers, shook hands with his lawyer, and left, leaving me standing in that empty courtroom that suddenly felt like a tomb. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell everyone what he had done, how he had manipulated, how he had planned this for years. But no one would listen anymore. By the time I reached the parking lot, I felt hollow. There were flashes of the media outside. Gossip pages had already caught wind of our case because of the property value and Daniel's business connections. Cameras, microphones, whispers. I covered my face with a scarf and walked past them, numb, pretending not to hear the questions. How does it feel to lose everything? Did you really abandon your children for your career? That one stung the most, because my children were my life. Everything I had done, every late night, every compromise, was for them. When I got home, or rather what used to be home, it didn't feel like mine anymore. Movers were already packing my things. My lawyer had warned me that I'd have to vacate the mansion within 48 hours. 48 hours to erase 12 years of memories. I walked through each room like a ghost. The living room still smelled faintly of my favorite candle, the vanilla and cedar one I used to light in the evenings. The walls held framed pictures of birthdays, vacations, first days of school. I stopped in front of one, my daughter Lily's 7th birthday. Her front teeth were missing, and her little brother Sam was beside her, cheeks covered in frosting. I reached out and touched the glass. That's when it hit me. Not the loss of the house, not the money, but the idea that I wouldn't wake up to their laughter anymore. That another woman might tuck them in. Because yes, Daniel had already moved on. Her name was Claudia, his assistant. A woman I had trusted around my children long before I knew what was really going on. I packed what little I could. Clothes, some photos, my mother's jewelry. The rest Daniel could keep. I didn't have the strength to fight anymore. That night, I drove for hours. I didn't even plan the route. I just kept driving until the city lights disappeared, and the road narrowed into a quiet stretch lined with trees. The GPS said I was 20 miles away from my mother's old place, the house I hadn't visited in over a decade. It was the only thing left in my name. The sky was bruised with dawn by the time I reached it. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Chipped paint, overgrown vines, and a roof that slanted slightly on one side, but somehow it still felt like a safe place, a place where I could hide, heal, or maybe just disappear. Inside, everything smelled of dust and time. I found old furniture covered in sheets, yellowed curtains, and a few of my childhood things tucked away in corners. There was silence, the kind that isn't empty but heavy. I sat on the floor in what used to be my mother's living room and cried for the first time since the court's verdict. For hours, I let everything spill out. The frustration, the helplessness, the guilt. The kind of pain that doesn't scream, just shakes you quietly from the inside. Days passed like fog. I didn't check my phone. I didn't talk to anyone. I cooked simple meals, walked barefoot through the garden, and sometimes just sat outside watching the wind move through the trees. It was strange how peace and grief could exist in the same space. But one morning, something changed. I was cleaning the attic, more out of habit than purpose. Dust floated through the sunlight like faint glitter, and I was lost in thought when I noticed a loose wooden panel behind an old dresser. I moved it aside and found a small metal safe hidden behind it. It was covered in dust and rust, like it had been there for decades. There was a small dial on it, and at first I laughed quietly to myself. My mother never mentioned having a safe. She was always so transparent about everything she owned. But then again, she was also a woman who had secrets she never spoke of. Quiet sacrifices I only understood after she passed. I knelt down and ran my fingers over the dial. The numbers were faded but still visible. I tried a few random combinations at first, but then paused. Something told me to stop guessing. And then it came to me. My birthday. The date she had written on every note, every cake, every card. I turned the dial carefully, my dantine. E3, there was a click. My heart skipped. I froze for a second, not sure if I imagined it. Then I pulled the handle gently, and the door creaked open. Inside was a small brown envelope, thick with papers. On top of it, a folded letter with my name written in my mother's handwriting. I sat there staring at it, my hands trembling. The ink was slightly faded, but still strong enough to make me feel like she was right there beside me again. I unfolded the letter slowly. Sarah, it began. If you're reading this, then life has brought you to a place where you've lost faith in justice. I hope I'm wrong, but I always knew there might come a day when you'd need this. I read those lines over and over. My mother was never dramatic, but her words carried a strange weight. I kept reading. This secret has always been my trump card, it said. I hid it not for my own sake, but for yours. Inside this envelope are documents that could change everything you think you know about our family, and about Daniel. My breath caught. About Daniel. I opened the envelope and saw a stack of old legal papers, photographs, and what looked like property documents. Some were dated years before my marriage. Others looked recent, too recent for my mother to have accessed before her death. How was that possible? My mind raced as I flipped through them. There were letters between Daniel and a law firm I didn't recognize. Bank transfers, property exchanges. Some of them had my forged signature on them. I felt my chest tighten. I had no idea what any of it meant yet. But something told me this wasn't just about money. My mother had found something. Something that could explain everything. The sudden way Daniel became so confident during our divorce. The way his lawyer had insider information. Even how easily he had gained custody of our kids. The last page in the stack was a photocopy of a will. My mother's will, but not the one I had seen when she died. This one had a different signature, different terms. In this version, she had left me not just the countryside house, but a controlling share in a trust I never knew existed. And Daniel's name was on it too. It made no sense. I sat there for hours, surrounded by dust and sunlight and secrets I didn't know how to face. Every instinct in me said to stop, to put it all back in the safe and forget it. But then I remembered my children's faces, the way Lily had cried in court when she realized she'd have to live with her father. I couldn't walk away. Not this time. That night I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the words. My trump card. What did she mean? What did she know about Daniel? I decided to start digging. I charged my phone for the first time in days and opened my email. There were dozens of messages, from Karen, from my friends, from reporters. But one email stood out. It was from an unknown sender, timestamped just 2 days before my mother's death. The subject line read, "For Sarah, when the time is right," and the attached file. It was encrypted. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept turning over the papers I'd found in the safe, tracing the faded edges of the envelope like it could somehow whisper answers. The words in my mother's letter echoed through my mind. This secret has always been my trump card. I didn't know what to feel. Shock? Fear? Anger? All of it, maybe. Because somehow, even after everything Daniel had done, I still didn't believe he could have fooled me to that extent. But the documents said otherwise. The transfers, the fake signatures, they were all there right in front of me. My mother must have found out something long before I did, and she had kept it hidden, waiting for a time when I would truly need it. I sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp on, the rest of the house swallowed by darkness. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, and the creaking of the old wooden beams above made it sound like the house itself was alive, listening. I opened my laptop and tried to open that encrypted email I'd found earlier, the one titled "For Sarah, when the time is right." But it needed a password. I tried everything. My birthday, my mother's name, her favorite song, even my father's old date of death. Nothing worked. Eventually, around 4 a.m., exhausted and frustrated, I closed the laptop and laid my head on the table. That's when I noticed something. There was a small, faintly written note on the last page of my mother's letter, almost invisible in the dim light. It read, "Everything begins where it ended." At first, I thought it was just something poetic she had written. My mother loved phrases like that. But then it clicked. The place where everything ended for her, where she had taken her last breath, was this very house. I walked slowly toward her old room, my heart thudding quietly. The door still had her crocheted name tag hanging on it, Grace. The room smelled faintly of lavender and medicine, even after all these years. I turned on the lamp and scanned the walls, the drawers, the shelves. There was an old jewelry box on the dresser, the same one she had used since I was a child. Inside were her rings, a rosary, and a folded piece of paper. I opened it. It was a single line. Password, 1977 Grace. My mother was born in 1957. But 1977 was the year she married my father, the year she said her life truly began. I hurried back to the kitchen, typed 97 Grace into the encrypted file, and pressed enter. It opened. My stomach dropped. Inside was a series of scanned documents and audio recordings, some of them dating back nearly 15 years. The first document was a scanned letter from a law firm I didn't recognize, Harrison and Bloom LLP. It was addressed to Daniel. The letter discussed asset restructuring and irrevocable trust allocation, legal terms that didn't make much sense to me then. But one line caught my eye. It said, "Per your instructions, Ms. Grace's estate will remain undisclosed to her daughter until the dissolution of the marital contract. Ms. Grace." My mother. I read it again, slower this time. Daniel had instructed lawyers, even before our divorce, to keep parts of my mother's estate hidden from me. And the lawyers had agreed. That meant the entire financial plan for her property, her trusts, maybe even her shares, had been manipulated by him long before she died, and she must have found out. The next file was an audio recording. I hesitated, then pressed play. A familiar voice filled the quiet room. My mother's voice, faint but steady. "Sarah," she said softly. "If you're hearing this, it means he's done it. I hoped I was wrong, but Daniel isn't the man you think he is. He's been working with the firm that handled my estate. They've been siphoning funds from the family trust, using your name as a cover. I didn't know how deep it went until it was too late. He's careful. Everything he does looks clean on paper." I froze. She took a shallow breath. "I've gathered what proof I could. It's all in the envelope. If you take this to court, make sure you find someone who isn't afraid to lose everything. Because Daniel will fight dirty. He always does." Her voice broke slightly before she ended the recording. I sat there staring at the screen, my chest tight, tears forming at the corners of my eyes. I'd been manipulated, lied to, and betrayed, not just as a wife, but as a daughter. My mother had tried to protect me from a truth I wasn't ready to face. For years, I thought Daniel's control was subtle. Emotional manipulation, small betrayals. I never imagined it reached into my own mother's affairs, into her final will. I leaned back, shaking. That old house felt heavier than ever, like the walls themselves carried the weight of her secret. By morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to run anymore. I packed the documents, the envelope, and my laptop into a bag and drove back to the city. The highway stretched endlessly, and as the skyline appeared again, I felt a strange mix of fear and purpose. I hadn't been back since the divorce. But this time I wasn't coming back to beg or cry. I was coming back for truth. The first person I went to was Karen, my lawyer. She looked shocked to see me. "Sarah, I've been calling you for days. Are you okay?" I nodded slowly. "I found something," I said. "Something about Daniel. About my mother." I handed her the envelope. She started flipping through the papers, her brows knitting together. "Where did you get these?" "My mother's house," I replied. She left them for me. Karen read for a few minutes in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. These are legitimate," she said finally. "The law firm signatures, the seal, everything checks out. Daniel was the executor of your mother's estate after her passing, wasn't he?" "Yes," I whispered. "He said it was temporary, just to help manage the property." Karen's lips tightened. "He transferred parts of her trust into an offshore account under your name. But you never signed the authorization." "That's forgery, Sarah. Serious forgery." I stared at her, the reality settling in like a cold stone in my chest. "All this time," I said slowly, "he wasn't just trying to win the divorce. He was trying to erase me completely. Legally, financially, emotionally." Karen looked at me with cautious sympathy. "We need to be careful. If what's in here is true, we could reopen your case, maybe even charge him with fraud. But we'll need undeniable proof." She paused, scanning one of the papers again. "And we'll need the originals, not just copies." I nodded. "They're in the safe. I can bring them." Over the next few days, I worked with Karen quietly. We verified the documents, traced the bank accounts, and found a paper trail leading to 2 offshore holdings, both registered under Daniel's business partners. One of those accounts had received over $800,000 in the same month my mother passed away, but what shocked me most was the date on one of the transactions, 3 days before she died. Daniel had been in contact with her lawyer right before her death. I didn't know what that meant, and I wasn't ready to think the worst. But a part of me, the part that had seen Daniel's calm cruelty, couldn't ignore the unease crawling under my skin. The more we uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. He had orchestrated everything: the hidden transfers, the forged signatures, the manipulation during our divorce. Every step had been carefully planned to make me look unstable and unfit, so he could take the house, the money, and the kids without resistance. But he hadn't expected me to find my mother's letter. I started recording everything. Every call, every meeting, every piece of evidence. I wasn't going to lose this time. Not to him. Not to anyone. Then something unexpected happened. A week after I returned to the city, I received a message from an unknown number. It said, "Stop digging, Sarah. Some things are better left buried." No name, no signature, just that single sentence. I showed it to Karen and she looked alarmed. "We'll get it traced," she said. But I could see the worry in her eyes. I didn't respond to the message. But it made me more determined. I went to see my children for the first time in weeks. Daniel had custody, but through the court's agreement, I had limited visitation rights. When Lily saw me, she ran and hugged me tightly. Sam followed, quieter but smiling shyly. I tried to hold it together for them. "How are you both?" I asked softly. Lily looked up at me with wide eyes. "Dad said you're going away for a while," she said. I forced a small smile. "Not this time," I whispered. "This time I'm staying." When Daniel appeared at the doorway, his expression was sharp, not angry but cautious. "You look tired," he said casually. "Still trying to fight what's already done?" I met his gaze calmly. "You'd be surprised what can be undone," I said quietly. For a moment, his mask slipped. Just a flicker, a flash of something dark behind his eyes. Then he smiled again, smooth and rehearsed. "Careful, Sarah. You don't want to make things worse for yourself." I just nodded. I've already seen the worst. That night, I drove back to my mother's house again, this time not to hide, but to collect everything she had left me. The originals, the proof. As I reached the attic, I noticed something I hadn't before. Behind the safe, there was a small hidden compartment in the floorboards. Inside, it was a black notebook, thin, leather-bound, and covered in dust. When I opened it, my mother's handwriting filled the pages. It wasn't a diary. It was notes, names, dates, conversations. She had been tracking Daniel long before she died, and on the last page, There was a single line written in bold ink. If something happens to me, don't go to the police first. Go to the man who once loved justice more than power, Edward Harrison. Harrison. The same name from the law firm, Harrison and Bloom LLP. It wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The countryside was still wrapped in mist, and the old house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet. I made a cup of coffee and sat by the window, holding the black notebook I had found the night before. The pages inside still didn't feel real to me. My mother, my gentle, soft-spoken mother, had spent her final years secretly documenting my husband's betrayal. There were names of lawyers, meeting places, account numbers, even the dates of wire transfers. She had written everything in careful detail, like a woman preparing for a storm she knew she wouldn't survive to see end. The name on the last page kept echoing in my mind. Edward Harrison. It was strange. I remembered hearing the name before. Years ago, when Daniel and I were still married, he had once mentioned an Edward Harrison, a man he used to work with before starting his own company. Daniel said Edward was too moral to survive in business, and that he'd left the firm after a disagreement about ethics. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but now, the connection felt too sharp to be coincidence. I decided to find him. It took me the better part of a day, digging through old business directories and law forms online. Finally, I found a listing. Edward R. Harrison, attorney at law, retired, living 2 hours north of the city. No phone number, but there was an address. That was enough. By noon, I was on the road again. The drive felt longer than it was, my mind running through every possibility. Would he even see me? Would he remember Daniel? Would he help? When I finally reached the address, it was a small house at the edge of a quiet town. There was a garden in front, overgrown but cared for, with a dog sleeping lazily near the porch. I knocked. After a moment, a man in his late 60s opened the door. He had gray hair, sharp eyes, and the posture of someone who had spent years watching people lie. "Yes?" he asked cautiously. "Mr. Harrison?" I said. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. You might remember Daniel Mitchell." His expression changed, a flash of recognition, then something like irritation. "Ah, Daniel," he said slowly. "That name I haven't heard in years. What brings you here?" "It's about my mother," I said. "Grace Palmer. You used to handle her estate, before Daniel took over." He frowned, motioning for me to come in. "Yes, I remember Grace," he said as I stepped into the living room. It was lined with old books and smelled faintly of pine. She was one of the kindest clients I ever had. I was sorry to hear about her passing. I nodded, my throat tight. Before she died, she left me something. A letter and a notebook. "Your name was in it." He raised an eyebrow. "My name?" I opened the notebook and showed him the last page. He read it quietly, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. Then he sighed. "I told her to be careful," he murmured. "I knew Daniel was meddling with her finances, but she insisted she could handle it. I never realized how deep it went." "You knew he was involved?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Yes, I warned her years ago. Daniel used to come by the firm often, charming everyone, but I saw through him. He was ambitious, too ambitious. He wanted to control every account, every client. When I refused to give him access to Grace's trust, he found another lawyer who would. That was the beginning of the end." My heart sank. "Then you know what he's done?" "I know enough," Edward said, his tone calm but firm. "But proof is what matters now. What did Grace leave you?" I handed him the envelope of documents. He adjusted his glasses and began to read, page by page, his expression shifting from curiosity to quiet anger. "These are damning," he said finally. "If these hold up, Daniel could face charges for fraud, perjury, and possibly theft from a protected trust." I exhaled slowly. "I want to bring him down, Mr. Harrison. But I don't just want revenge. I want the truth out. For my mother. For my children. I want to show the court what kind of man he really is." Edward studied me for a moment, then nodded. Grace always said you had her strength. I can help you, but we have to be careful. Men like Daniel, they hide their crimes in plain sight. We spent the next few hours going over every document. Edward explained what each paper meant, the trust arrangements, the offshore accounts, the legal loopholes Daniel had exploited. My head was spinning, but for the first time in months, I felt like I had direction. When I left his house that evening, the sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky in soft gold and crimson. Edward stood at the door, hands in his pockets. Sarah, he said before I got into my car, your mother was a brave woman. She believed justice had to be earned quietly, not shouted. Be patient. Don't rush this. The calmest storms destroy the most. I smiled faintly. I understand. That night, back at my mother's house, I wrote everything down. Every plan, every step. I wasn't going to let Daniel see me coming. Over the next few weeks, Edward and I worked quietly. He reconnected with a few trusted contacts from his old firm, retired lawyers and investigators who owed him favors. One of them, a forensic accountant named Maya, agreed to trace the flow of money through Daniel's accounts. Maya was sharp, methodical, and discreet. Within days, she found connections that even Edward hadn't expected. Shell companies registered under fake names, all linking back to Daniel's business. But the most shocking discovery came from a bank statement she pulled from an offshore server. A $2.3 million transfer to a private account made 2 days after my mother's death. That account had Daniel's initials. When I saw it, I felt physically sick. I had suspected he took money from my mother's trust, but seeing proof, with numbers, dates, and his signature, was something else entirely. We now had enough to reopen the case. But Edward wanted to go further. If we rush to court now, he said, he'll hide the rest. We need him to think he's safe. So we waited. I pretended to go on with life as usual. I attended the mandatory visitation sessions with my children, smiled politely when Daniel's lawyer was around, and acted like a woman who had accepted defeat. But inside, I was documenting everything, every word, every subtle threat. Because Daniel was growing careless. He thought he'd won completely. And when people think they've won, they start to talk too much. One afternoon, during a drop-off, he said something that chilled me. You know, Sarah, he smirked. Your mother was a clever woman. Shame she didn't live long enough to see how her precious trust really helped me. I froze. What do you mean? He smiled, that same smug, rehearsed smile. Nothing. Just that life has a funny way of balancing things out. I didn't respond. But I knew what he was doing. He was bragging, mocking, testing whether I still suspected him. When I told Edward about it later, he simply nodded. He's revealing himself, he said. We'll use his arrogance against him. Edward helped me prepare an anonymous submission to the district attorney's office. The documents detailed the financial fraud and included copies of the forged signatures. We didn't mention my name yet, not until the investigation was underway. Within 2 weeks, the DA's office opened a preliminary inquiry. Daniel was summoned quietly for questioning. He must have sensed something because the next day, he called me, the first time he'd done so in months. Sarah, he said, his voice unusually tense. Did you do something? Did you talk to anyone? I kept my tone calm. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play games with me, he hissed. You think you can outsmart me now, after everything? I took a slow breath. No, I said softly. I think I finally understand you. He hung up. That call confirmed everything. He was nervous, and that meant we were getting close. But then something unexpected happened. Again. 2 days later, I came home from the market to find the front door of my mother's house slightly open. I froze. I always locked it before leaving. My pulse quickened as I stepped inside. The living room was untouched, but when I reached the kitchen, I saw it. The safe was open. Empty. The envelope, the originals, the notebook, gone. Panic surged through me. I searched the entire house, Every drawer, every cabinet. Nothing. Whoever had done it knew exactly where to look. I called Edward immediately. "They're gone," I said breathlessly. "Everything. The originals, the proof. It's all gone." "Calm down," he said. "We made copies, remember?" "Yes, but if Daniel knows I found them—" "He doesn't," Edward interrupted. "Not unless someone told him." That silence between us was heavy. There were only 3 people who knew. Me, Edward, and Maya. "I'll handle this," Edward said finally. "Stay put for now. Don't call anyone else." That night I sat alone in the dark, staring at the empty space where the safe had been. The air felt colder, heavier. I knew Daniel had reached into my world again. But this time, he had no idea that the copies were already in the DA's hands. As I sat there, I realized something deeper than fear. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the broken woman he left behind. I wasn't the victim anymore. He had taken everything from me once, my home, my children, my dignity. But what he didn't take was my resolve. And this time, it was my turn to move quietly, to strike calmly, and to make sure when justice arrived, it wouldn't be loud. It would be final. It'd be continued in part 4. If you followed me this far, thank you for staying through every quiet turn of this story. The truth is like water. It always finds a way through. If you want to hear how the calmest revenge unfolds, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to My Calm Revenge. When I woke up the next morning, the sunlight filtering through the lace curtains felt softer than usual, like it was trying to comfort me. The storm of the previous night had passed, both outside and inside me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind heavy but clearer than before. The envelope's words, "This secret has always been my trump card," still echoed in my head. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What kind of secret could my mother have meant? What did she hide all those years? And why did she want me to find it only after everything in my life had collapsed? I spent most of that day sitting at the old wooden table, the letter spread out in front of me, my coffee growing cold beside it. The handwriting was hers, strong and slightly slanted, with that same old-fashioned elegance she carried in everything she did. But behind those calm letters, I could feel her urgency, her intent. It was as if she knew that someday I would lose everything and need something to bring me back to life. The documents I'd found in the safe were still confusing. Deeds, share certificates, old contracts, all linked somehow to my ex-husband's company, but the names were different. Some were under shell corporations, and one under a name that made my heart skip, S. Malik Holdings. My mother's maiden name was Malik. My breath caught. Could she have been part of his company's early days? Did she invest before he married me? I needed answers. So I drove into the city again. It felt strange, returning after weeks in isolation. My once familiar world, coffee shops, boutiques, the lawyers' offices, felt distant, like a stage where I no longer belonged. I parked near a quiet cafe and met with someone I hadn't seen in years. My mother's old friend, Margaret, a retired accountant who used to handle some of her finances. I had called her the night before, asking if she remembered anything about my mother's investments. Margaret's eyes widened when I placed the documents on the table. She adjusted her glasses, flipped through the papers, and sighed. "Oh, Anna," she said softly, "your mother was much smarter than anyone gave her credit for. These are controlling shares, quiet ones, in your ex-husband's company. But they were disguised under layers of other firms so that no one would connect her to it." I stared at her, speechless. "So, she owned part of his business?" "He never mentioned it." Margaret nodded. "She helped fund the company when it was just an idea. Back then, your husband was struggling. She believed in him, and in you two as a couple. But she also protected herself. This," she tapped the paper gently, "was her insurance." I felt my pulse quicken. My mother had secretly owned a stake in the company that had now thrown me away. My ex-husband had built his empire on foundations that she helped lay, and I never knew. And now, those shares were mine. Quiet, hidden, but legally valid. The thought was dizzying. I went home that night with a new kind of fire in me, I didn't tell anyone what I'd discovered. I didn't even tell my lawyer yet. Instead, I started to research, cross-referencing every document, learning everything I could about corporate law, ownership structures, and silent shares. It was like learning to walk again, but this time, I walked with purpose. My calm was no longer weakness. It was my shield. Over the next weeks, I moved carefully. I contacted a discreet financial advisor recommended by Margaret, a man named Daniel Pierce, who specialized in tracing hidden assets and managing sensitive transitions. He came to the house one afternoon, dressed neatly, with a voice as calm as mine. I showed him everything. He took a deep breath. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "this is significant. If what you're showing me is authentic, and it looks to be, then you hold silent, controlling power. That means, technically, your husband's company cannot make major moves without your consent." I sat there stunned. "You mean I could stop him?" He smiled faintly. "You could do more than that. You could change the entire structure of his empire." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, thinking about the years I'd spent living under his shadow. The humiliation of losing everything, of standing in that courtroom while his lawyer painted me as unstable, unworthy. I remembered the cold look in his eyes when he told me, "You'll have nothing left when I'm done." I remembered how he smirked when the judge ruled in his favor. And now, quietly, in the stillness of my mother's old house, I realized something extraordinary. I didn't have to destroy him to win. I just had to let the truth work for me. The kind of revenge that didn't scream or burn, but whispered, patiently through legal documents and careful timing. Daniel and I began to plan. He verified the authenticity of the shares, contacted discreet auditors, and built a legal case that would hold. It was like watching chess pieces move slowly across a board, each step deliberate. Meanwhile, I maintained my silence. I didn't call my ex. I didn't post anything online. I didn't even change my address officially. I simply existed, quietly, while the world assumed I was broken. One afternoon, as I was cleaning the upstairs hallway, I found another letter inside a drawer, one I had somehow missed. It was addressed to me, in the same familiar handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Dear Anna," it began, "if you are reading this, then life has tested you in ways I hoped it never would. But remember this, calm is not surrender. Silence is not weakness. The ones who speak least often carry the heaviest truth. Whatever pain has been done to you, do not rush to destroy. Instead, let the truth do what anger cannot." I sat down on the floor and wept. My mother had always been a quiet woman, but now I understood her strength. She had planned this, not out of spite, but out of love. She knew life could turn cruel, and she wanted to leave me a way to stand again, not through violence, but through justice. That night, Daniel called. "It's ready," he said. "We've traced everything. You're listed as the sole inheritor of those holding companies. Your mother's name is clean, but the paper trail is clear. We can move forward whenever you're ready." "Move forward how?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He paused. "We'll call for a shareholder audit. Your husband doesn't know you're the beneficial owner. When the audit happens, he'll have to face that truth in a legal setting. Quietly, professionally." I looked out the window at the moonlight falling on the old trees. It felt like my mother was still there, guiding me. "Then let's begin," I said softly. Over the next few weeks, a quiet storm began to build. My ex-husband received a legal notice from the corporate board requesting a review of shareholder structures. He likely dismissed it at first, assuming it was routine. I could almost imagine his arrogance, his certainty that nothing could touch him. But when the documents revealed my name, when the boardroom fell silent, that would be my real moment of peace. Meanwhile, I prepared myself emotionally. I didn't want to go into this with hatred. I reminded myself every day, revenge wasn't about making him suffer. It was about restoring my dignity, about reclaiming what was mine, piece by piece, until I could look at myself in the mirror again and see someone whole. The day before the audit, I went to my children's school. I stood at a distance, watching them from across the street as they played. My heart ached. I missed them so much. My daughter's laugh, my son's curious questions. They were still so young, still innocent in all this. I promised myself that whatever happened next, I would make sure their future was stable, not poisoned by their father's greed or my pain. When the day came, I didn't attend the meeting. I didn't need to. Daniel handled everything, but I imagined it vividly. My ex-husband's expression as he saw my name listed among the majority shareholders. The silence in the room as realization dawned, the calm destruction of his confidence. Daniel called me afterward. His voice was steady. It's done. He knows. I took a long breath. The air felt lighter. And his reaction? Shock, disbelief, then silence. He can't undo this quietly. He'll have to face the board, and they'll want answers. I thanked him, hung up, and stood there for a long time, listening to the wind. It didn't feel like triumph, not the loud kind at least. It felt like justice, like something settling back into balance. That night, I took out the envelope again, the one that had started it all. I traced my fingers over the fading ink and whispered, "You were right, Mom. Calm really is the sharpest weapon." After Daniel told me it was done, I didn't feel the rush of triumph I'd always imagined. Instead, I felt a strange quiet inside me, as if something heavy had finally lifted, leaving space for air, for light. I didn't dance, I didn't scream. I just sat on the porch of my mother's house, watching the evening sky melt into gold. The world looked the same, but I wasn't. For the first time in years, I felt steady, not powerful, not victorious, just steady and free. But the story didn't end there. My ex-husband, Richard, wasn't someone who accepted surprises easily. I knew that. The man who once smiled confidently across boardrooms, who had lawyers on speed dial and journalists ready to write flattering articles about him, wasn't going to stay silent after discovering that the company he thought was solely his had my fingerprints all over it. For a few weeks, nothing happened publicly. I lived in the quiet, waiting for a storm that didn't come. Then one morning, as I was watering the plants outside, Daniel called again. His tone was calm, but I could hear the weight behind his words. "He's filed a counterclaim," Daniel said. "He's arguing that your mother's investment was a personal loan, not a share purchase." I sighed softly. "Of course he did." Daniel continued. "He's trying to buy time, but he doesn't realize that the original documents, the ones your mother signed, are watertight. I've already spoken to the auditors. There's a clear paper trail showing she purchased equity, not issued a loan." I smiled faintly, even as my heart pounded. Then let him fight. Those next few months tested me in ways I didn't expect. There were hearings, meetings, long nights of waiting. The media picked up whispers of corporate disputes. I saw his name on the news again. This time not as the brilliant entrepreneur everyone admired, but as a CEO under internal investigation for concealment of shareholder information. It wasn't the scandal I wanted. I didn't want his public destruction. That wasn't my kind of revenge. But seeing him face consequences, watching his carefully constructed world begin to tremble, it felt like balance returning to a tilted scale. One evening, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, but I knew that handwriting anywhere. Richard. I hesitated before opening it. Inside, there was just one short letter. "You've made your point. You could have come to me directly. We could have worked this out privately, but you've chosen war. I hope you're proud." I stared at the words for a long time. Not out of anger, but because they felt so small, so fragile. The man who once took everything from me was now writing letters trying to appeal to reason. The irony wasn't lost on me. I wrote no reply. A month later, his lawyers reached out to Daniel. They wanted a settlement, quiet, off the record, generous. He offered to buy out my shares for a price that could easily replace my old mansion, my lost comfort. For a moment I was tempted. It would have been the easy way out. Take the money, disappear, start over. But something inside me said no. I didn't want money. I wanted truth. So I asked Daniel to decline politely and inform the board that I intended to take an active role as a major shareholder. That's when everything truly shifted. Suddenly, the silence broke. Calls came in, Former employees reached out, whispering stories of manipulation and financial misconduct. They said they'd always suspected something was off, but no one dared to speak. When they learned I was part of the ownership now, they began to talk, quietly at first, then openly. One of them, a woman named Carla, asked to meet me. We sat together at a cafe near the old downtown district, where no one from his corporate circle would notice us. She told me things I didn't want to hear. How he had funneled money into personal projects. How he'd pressured people to lie under oath during our divorce hearings. She was nervous, trembling as she spoke. I listened, took notes, and thanked her. As I walked back to my car that evening, I realized something important. Revenge, at least the kind I was now living, wasn't a single act. It wasn't one dramatic confrontation. It was a long, deliberate unraveling of lies, a restoration of truth, one thread at a time. And strangely, the calmer I became, the stronger I felt. I began working with Daniel and a new legal team to compile evidence. Not to destroy him, but to bring everything into the light. Slowly, a quiet case formed behind the scenes. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about clarity, integrity, and reclaiming my place in the world. Months passed. The case deepened. Reporters began sniffing around, and then one morning the story broke. A major financial outlet ran a headline. CEO under fire. Hidden shareholder structure revealed. Family ties surface. The article was factual, respectful, but firm. It didn't sensationalize. It simply laid out the truth. How my mother had funded the company, how her shares were concealed, how I had inherited them, and how Richard had knowingly hidden this from regulators. I didn't give interviews. I didn't post on social media. I just sat quietly, sipping tea by the window as the world digested what it had ignored for so long. That was the calmest victory I'd ever known. Over the following weeks, the company's board voted to remove Richard temporarily while investigations continued. His charm, his polished image, all of it started to fade. And as for me, I began receiving letters of apology from people who had once sided with him. Even some of his own friends reached out, saying they admired how I'd handled it all with dignity. But the best moment came when I was granted a formal hearing to reopen my custody case. The court had taken notice of the new revelations, his dishonesty, the concealed assets, the manipulation. I stood in front of the same judge who once ruled against me. My voice didn't shake this time. I spoke clearly, calmly, and truthfully. When the final ruling came weeks later, I sat in silence, tears streaming down my face. The judge awarded me joint custody. It wasn't everything. It wasn't full control or a mansion or riches, but it was fair, it was balanced, and it was mine. The first day I saw my children again, they ran to me like nothing had ever been broken. My daughter wrapped her arms around me, whispering, "Mom, you smell like the old house." My son laughed and said, "Dad says you're really smart now." I smiled through the tears and said, "I always was." We spent that afternoon at the small lake near the country house, throwing stones into the water, watching the ripples fade into stillness. And in that quiet moment, I realized something. Revenge isn't about making others fall. It's about standing again, gracefully, when they thought you never could. A few months later, I sold part of my shares and rebuilt my life slowly. Not lavishly, not dramatically, but honestly. I restored the country house, kept my mother's garden alive, and started helping other women who were going through similar divorces. My calm became my strength, my story a quiet whisper of hope for those who had been silenced. Sometimes, when I sit by the fireplace at night, I think about that first day I found the dusty envelope, the smell of the old wood, the weight of the letter, the tremor in my hands. It feels like another lifetime now. But that envelope was more than paper and ink. It was a message from the past, a map back to myself. And I followed it, not through anger, but through patience, not through noise, but through stillness. And maybe that's the truest revenge there is. Because when the world expects you to shatter, the quiet act of standing tall again is the loudest thing you can do. I still keep my mother's letter framed on the wall above my desk. The ink has faded a little with time, but the words remain. Calm is not surrender. Silence is not weakness. Whenever life feels uncertain, I read those words again. They remind me of what I learned through all of this. That power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it hides inside an old, dusty envelope, waiting for the right moment to be found. Now, when people ask how I managed to come back from losing everything, I just smile and say, by being still. And that's how I found my calm revenge. If you've listened this far, thank you. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that patience and truth can be stronger than anger, then please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to my Calm Revenge. Every week, I share stories like this and of quiet strength, justice, and the kind of revenge that heals instead of destroys. Because sometimes, the calmest voice tells the most powerful story.